nice. Well, welcome to everybody. Thanks for participating in that. Just kind of get ourselves going for the afternoon. So let's see what is next. So we're going to kind of get right into our practices here today with a little activity, and I'm going to go ahead and exit out of there. And I'm going to put this in the chat. Carol, I didn't give this to you. Sorry. I think you can write on this to everybody. I hope so. I'm not always the best with this. But what I was thinking you could do is if you scroll down to the second page is like, what are some of your current practices? Like, do you have restorative? I didn't spell that right, but restorative practices. And where does that fit? You can, just put a X in the box, however you want. Thanks, Carol. But you could maybe just go through that chart, kind of list some of the things that maybe are current discipline practices in your space. Just take, maybe 2 minutes to do that. And yes, feel free to add in. I see multiple people are putting in PBIS because you may have different takes on the level of effectiveness, which I'm noticing as well. And that's okay. I think this is just wonderful. You can, if you use restorative practices, you could add that one in as well.
I'm curious about the PBIS not effective.
Feel free to reach out to us. Carol is also a PBIS facilitator. After today, anybody on this session, you're welcome to talk to us if you have any specific questions or concerns about stuff. We're happy to brainstorm and problem solve with you. All right. So I'm just going to take a brief look at this. I think we're slowing down a little bit. I see youth court. Is that within the school or outside of school? I don't know if that's like the legal court or something named in your program. So feel free to clarify in the chat if you like to. If not, you can, that's fine as well. Check in and check out. We do see a lot of that. I wonder, does anybody do renew? That's something else we sometimes see. Youth aid panel, mentoring, again, more check in and check out. I'm glad I'm seeing a lot of things you feel like you have effective practices in place. I see PBIS, we have 3 ratings and 3 different ratings for the people who put it in up there. Mediation, OSS and ISS, you rated as not effective. The data tends to agree with that for sure. Reward systems, behavior, counseling groups, all, kind of in the middle, different levels of effectiveness.
And Kari, Jessica said youth course is facilitated within a class, so it's an elective at their high school.
Oh, very interesting. That's pretty cool. All right. Jessica, would you want to type in a little bit more about that or unmute, and just maybe others on the session might be interested to hear a little bit more. If you're not, feel free to just send some information to Carol or I, and we could pass it on to the participants.
I don't mind speaking.
Oh, thank you.
No problem. So youth court, like I said, is in one of our classes. It's as an elective, and students do get credit for it. So the school determines what the criteria is for the offense. And then the student comes before a panel of their peers. And then the idea is that the students who have been trained by the public defender's office then come up with a restorative practice for what the offense was, for the perpetrator to participate in to restore the harm that was done.
Wow, that's pretty cool. Really interesting. And you're finding success then?
It is successful for the minor offenses, yes.
Okay, for minor offenses. What would be considered minor?
Class cutting.
Okay.
So they try to find methods to decrease that particular
Yes.
offense, but for minor
Mhm.
offenses, class cutting.
Right. Yeah. So you're not talking about like weapons violations or
No,
maybe use of banned substances or something like that.
nope.
Would not be. Okay. Yep. I just want to clarify and make sure that's what I was thinking, but you know what they say about assuming. So don't want to do that. All right, guys. Thanks so much for that. And Jessica, thank you so much for explaining that. Does anybody have any questions or comments before I go into our learning intentions for today?
Nothing in chat.
Okay, so we're going to just do a brief culturally responsive discipline definition, and then we want to delve into these 5 current findings on ways to promote culturally responsive discipline. In the tiny URL document that Carol shared with you, there are resources that go with different things that you'll see over the next hour or so that'll allow you to kind of go in a little bit deeper. With a session kind of this short, we're going to just kind of touch base, go in a little bit on each of these, but I feel like we could probably delve much deeper into some of these, but we just really wouldn't have time today just because of the session time. All right, so we're going to do identity, voice, supportive environments, situational appropriateness, and I'm just going to touch on using data for equity. Carol did do a session this morning. I see a few names that are familiar. That would be like what you would think about after kind of hearing some of this information from this session, going into that data for equity work. At the end of the session, for everybody else, I do have the title of Carol's session. It was recorded and it would be available for you to listen to. It will talk about risk ratio and disproportionality. Carol talked a little bit about implicit bias, and so that might be something else that you may want to listen to. And we were about an hour for that session, a little over an hour. We did not take the whole hour and a half. So just for timing, if you're interested. So here we go. Culturally responsive discipline is the idea we want to increase our ability to meet student need in order to foster positive student, teacher, and family school relationships that maximize academic engagement. Through developing a process of developing awareness of the significance of our students' backgrounds, like historical context, and intentionally integrating their customs and values into our curriculum, instruction, and school environment. So we wanted to frame too, we have the definition. We know we want to talk about some of the latest research back on the other slide, voice, situational awareness. We see, in the previous slide, this idea of foster positive student, teacher, and family school relationships. Of course, our end goal is always, always academic engagement. We want to see kids who are graduating and going on to have fulfilling lives, whether that's college and career or straight to career, trade, whatever that may be. But we want to have the awareness as well of what people bring to the table. What is their background? So in thinking about that, if you're here today thinking about, culturally responsive discipline practices, why? What is your why for attending? Is it just personal? Is it why because this is an initiative within your system, your school building, your district, or I know we have people from approved private programs on today. Why is that so important to you? So take a minute to think about that. And then if anybody wants to put their why in the chat or unmute to talk about that, that's fine.
Kari says, I feel this may benefit our progress in implementing PBIS and how it relates to promoting a positive behavior. Darlene says increase engagement in a cyber setting.
Perfect.
Increase the unexpected behaviors with our younger students.
Okay. Thank you. Your why can be very personal. So I appreciate those who felt comfortable in sharing, but I also appreciate you, feeling like if you want to keep your, that personal as well. So moving into this a little bit, we want to talk about that first point, identity. So our identity is a lot of things, right? If you think about yourself, what makes your identity? It is race and ethnicity, but there's other aspects of like your culture. So there's this concept of intersectionality that we want to kind of think about when we think about identity. So you can see on your screen, it defines intersectionality as multiple identities that each person has that overlap and contribute to scenarios where aspects of their identity can either result in access to certain resources or provide privilege. So to make our systems more culturally responsible, we're asking ourselves as educators to have that awareness and understanding of our own personal cultures and values and how that impacts classroom and school environments, right? So what is our identity, student identity, and what's the identity of the community? And I would say even with community, when you look at districts, Carol and I go to many of the districts here in this county. There are 21, and school to school have different identities. There can be all these facets that come into play. So I said I'm a Buffalo Bill fan. I was born in Buffalo. We left Buffalo and I moved to North Carolina. And we lived there for 8 years. I came here in 7th grade, and I've lived in Pennsylvania now for like 40 years, almost 40 years. Don't guess my age. I look younger. I look good, y'all. Anyway, nonetheless, like not everybody knows that about me. And there's a very different culture from Buffalo, New York to a very small town in North Carolina, about an hour and a half from Raleigh, to Montgomery County. I've lived here, for almost 40 years. But nonetheless, that's part of my identity, these different places, that shape you. So that's what you're thinking about in identity. You're thinking about, the sum of your parts. And then being able to say, but these kids in front of me, this administrator or fellow teacher, what are the sum of their parts? Any thoughts, or anybody wants to kind of unmute and just talk on that a little bit, or anything to add?
I think, like I shared this morning, I had 3 different elementaries in the district I worked in, and they had very different identities. The community had an identity, and each individual school had its identity. So when I told my story about being in training and going through the whole, process for a new teacher and riding a bus around the community, the identity of my school that I was going to work in was very, it wasn't looked upon very well. So, and again, what we see from outside is different than what we feel from inside too, when it comes to identity, right? We know our identity, and I loved my school, but other people didn't know us, but our identity was very different. And, for most part in the community, they thought what they wanted to think, so that's where I see identity coming from a lot.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point, Carol. It happens in every organization, whether it's education or business, but I bet there's a few on here who are like, yeah, if you get transferred to X school, it's because of X, which is either sort of the positive, like, ooh, who did you know to get there, right? Or, oh, you got sent there, and that kind of happens. And that's identity. And that it could be totally biased, right? You could get to that school that people are like, and it's wonderful. It's just wonderful. So So in thinking about identity, many of us very clearly identify with our name, right? Our given name. And my parents were weird. No, well, kind of, but no. But they spell my name Kari, right? And it's Kari. It's not Kari. And it kind of drives me crazy because I identify by my name, and my name is not Kari, it's Kari. It's not, I see there's another Kari on our call, our Zoom today. That's Carrie. So, there's something about what's in a name. So I just want you to take a minute. This is a fun activity you could do in a staff meeting, or, if you're doing work around diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, where you bring people together and you can talk about what's in a name. So where does your name come from? My name is actually Kari Lynn. It's not Kari. I just go by Kari, but it's Kari Lynn, and my mom had heard it in that Buffalo area, and she really liked it. So just take a minute, and then if you want to just share your name story, if you have one or something like that, you could put it in the chat, or you could unmute.
Hi, this is Sue, and
Okay.
I did a similar activity, except we did a lineup by middle names because that kind of shares a different story.
Oh, cool.
So I did the similar thing to just kind of show a shift in our school community. We have a whole new development coming in, so it changed almost the socioeconomic and even the cultural ethnicity of the school because it's a small school. So we did this lineup. And my name is Sue Mi. It's a Korean name. So growing up, it was like first name is Sue, middle name is Mi. But in Korea, it's just my first name is Sumi. So it's just kind of growing up in the United States. I had a middle name of Mi, but it really isn't the middle name. It's just part of my full name, if that makes sense.
Yes, that's exactly the same as me, right? But not Korean, but I wasn't given a middle name. Lynn just stands as it. So that's really cool. I love the idea of going by middle name as well. Any other stories? Is there a good one behind your name, Carol?
Yes, actually, but I wasn't going to share it because I wanted our participants to share. So my middle name is actually Fortuna, and it's an Italian name, and my grandmother's name was Fortuna Cagasi. So that's where my middle name comes from, and it means fortune in Italian. So I think there's a lot of like what Sue said. I think our middle names really tell more of a story than our first names do sometimes, because it's that relative. It's that whoever was in their lives when you were born, that you were blessed with their name. So
very cool. Thanks for sharing. I never knew that about Carol.
Yeah, see that? Darlene responded that her name is her mom's middle name and my aunt's middle name, but she originally wanted to combine it to Darlene. Or Darlene instead of Darlene.
I like that. I like both, Darlene.
Yeah. So Kari says her real name is really Carolyn, but they've always called her Kari.
That Carolyn is my mother-in-law, and like Sue and Carol were saying, had I had a daughter, I have two sons, I thought about Marilyn as a middle name for Marion and Carolyn, both the mom's names. So that's really cool. Okay, well, thanks. Again, this is a way to get to identity. Like Sue said, I think I might like the middle name thing a little bit better than just even saying first name. But there's tons of things like this, and this is just stuff you could do. You could do this in your classroom, or like I said, building wide. Okay, so let's think about some questions here. So when we think about identity, we think about, so a student is loud. Are they disrespectful, or are they excited and enthusiastic about their learning? And even if you don't think they're enthusiastic and excited about the learning, doesn't mean that they're disrespectful. Are they just excited to be in the space? Is there something about the space? So a question to consider when you're thinking about kids. And if they are loud and what is perceived as disrespectful, then how do conversations occur about what we'll talk about later, situational appropriateness. When a student questions a teacher's role publicly, is he defiant or does he value knowing the purpose of a rule before he'll follow it? I've raised that child. That second question is my younger son. He always wants to know the why. And it took us a while, we figured it out. And then we had to kind of talk to the school about it. Like, yeah, he's not just trying to get under your skin. He just doesn't buy it. He just hasn't. He wants to know the why. So, thinking about some of that. And then this last one, there's a really great video about this. This example. And it says when, somebody's tapping their pencil, are they just being disrespectful or disruptive, or is she keeping rhythm to learn? Is she just tapping because it's calming, because it's white noise? So the video, Carol, you might know about this video too. Guys, it's this young man, and he becomes a drummer, but he was constantly getting in trouble because he was always moving, right, and tapping and doing all this stuff, till he found this one teacher who put drumsticks in his hands, like literally. And it changed him, right? It's the old adage of it takes one. One person can change the trajectory. And so it's a really cool video. I don't know if we could find it and maybe send it to you guys later, but it's just a really powerful statement, and it kind of comes to that third question.
Yeah, Laura Pottsgrove put it in the chat. It's what would Mr. Jansen do?
Thank you.
The name of the video. And it kind of gives you goosebumps when you watch it, because little kid, and they picked the cutest kid in the world to do it with.
For sure. Okay, so any thoughts on those questions? Is this stuff that we're talking to ourselves if we're classroom teachers, or for those of you who are administrators or school psychologists or speech language pathologists, whatever your role is, what's our first thought? Is it they're just not following my rules, or is it, oh, they're excited? Oh, they need to move. Oh, they're not clear on what it is we're doing and why. Let's talk a little bit about the second part. So again, just a brief intro, a little bit on identity. Definitely delve into that much deeper. There's a lot about our identities. So you shared, the identity, if you will, of your building changed because of, new developments. This happens when you sometimes redistrict in school districts. But, so you have those larger identities, but, then getting into some of the identities, of staff and students. So voice is, thinking about, having our community, our families, our students with meaningful opportunities to be heard, to voice their opinions, and exercise agency and leadership within that school system. If you don't mind, doing a thumbs up, who here is currently working in a PBIS, a school that's implementing PBIS? So the reason I just brought that up is because one of the things we ask people who do PBIS, but I think it's not just about PBIS, in any of our systems, our schools, we want to have that parent voice, and it's deeper than having a PTO. It's, parents who, are involved, who bring their culture and their identity to the table to help support all the things we're looking at. We're looking at discipline, we're thinking about culturally responsive discipline in this session, all of that. But also, what about your community? So you're going to have people in your community who no longer have school children in the system, or don't have children yet, or never had children, or moved into the system after their kids were grown. And there's the businesses. how does the community also have a voice around, the good stuff you're doing in schools? How are they informed? How do they participate in those? And we want to think about some of these beliefs on the right side of the screen, where we want to believe that parents have dreams for their children and want the best for them. That parents have the capacity to support their children's learning, right? We want to believe, even if we know different things about a family, that just because we know X about them doesn't mean that they can't and won't support their children's learning. It may be up to us to help facilitate that a little bit. We want to be equal partners with parents and schools where possible. And the responsibility for building partnerships between school and home rests primarily with school staff and especially school leaders. Now, that one I could debate a little bit myself. I think that, it takes two. It's not always a 50-50 proposition, but I hope as a parent myself that I would be, just not laying back waiting for the school to try to engage me, that I would also take steps to engaging. Again, we do a lot of that in PBIS, but you don't have to do PBIS to build these great cultures, these positive cultures within your systems. So guiding principles for authentic family and community engagement are these 4 specific items. So if we want to have some of, that bridge, that gap between the home and the school, or the community and the school, how do we communicate that information to families? We live in a day and age very different than when I grew up. Technology did exist, but not to the degree that we see now, where we really depend on email and text messaging. And some of my kids' teachers have used the Remind app, or, Google, and they'll send you Google messages every week. Johnny's gotten this much work done this week. These assignments are completed. These aren't, there are a lot of ways, but are there still, I want to say, almost old-fashioned ways we still communicate, because I can get inundated with electronic communication and miss things, right? So how do we communicate? Decision-making, we talked about this again on the previous slide, but, how do we involve those stakeholder groups in thinking about engagement and being culturally responsive? How do we help learning at home, right? Provide information and ideas. My husband's a CPA, and he'll say, I'll get the new math. This is how I did it when I was young. And he sometimes gets almost indignant, right? I'm like, dude, there are a lot of good things about new math, right? But he doesn't kind of understand it. So immediately he puts up that wall, oh, but the way I did it and learned it was just fine, right? We have probably other families who feel some of that way, or were like, I was a terrible student. How would I ever help my child, right? So how do we help with learning at home? And then again, collaborating with the community. How do we coordinate resources and services from the community? There are many people in our county, and maybe some of you do this, who have really tapped into resources. You use the library system to come out to buildings. There's a bunch of different nature centers and things along those lines that come out and do support to schools. I know one of our districts got hooked in with Elmwood Park Zoo in Norristown, and had kids who had never had the opportunity to go to a zoo go to the zoo and see the animals. What a learning experience, right? So how do we get those services? There are mental health services. A lot of communities are tapping into those resources before and during and after COVID. We saw the need for things like that. So, we're doing different things and getting supportive, but, just kind of thinking of those. So what I'd like you to do I'd like you to think about those ways. Those 4 ways. I'll put the slide back up so that you can see it. But there are 4 different pages. And what are ways that you are doing this, or questions you might have about how could you do that better? So if you're able to go on that Jamboard and think about these 4 areas, and how can you work on them? How are you doing things in these areas that are culturally responsive, or ways, how could you, what questions you might have?
Also in the chat is our resources for today, Dina.
And you guys definitely need a little more time than what I was thinking. So let's just keep going on this. Try to get something, 1 or 2 things on each page if you have the information. But don't forget to go into the others. I'll keep this slide up in case you just need to see the definitions again.
I think one of the challenges most districts face is, how am I getting what we're doing out to the community? How am I promoting ourselves out in the community? How am I telling them that I want their input and their engagement? I think that's one of the hardest spots to get. I know when we're doing our fidelity checks for PBIS, that's one of them. Like, how are we getting other stakeholders? How are we going out into the community and kind of spreading our wings? So any ideas are great. And it's great that we can share that with each other.
Okay, so let's just review a little bit, because you might have not had time to read everything. I'll start with the communicating part. And there's a lot of different things on here, things that are familiar to me. I don't know if they're familiar to everybody, but class dojo. I like the inviting community groups to kindergarten orientation and back to school nights. That's a great idea. Newsletters, family training sessions. I think that comes up a couple of times on here. Not assuming that people use email or have access to printers at home. I think, that's really helpful. I know I saw people talking about, and maybe on this page or a different page, like, how do you let parents know how to access stuff? Some of our curricular resources, I know for my own kids, there were like different websites. So like, how do you access them? Remember where that information is. You get some of that stuff on back to school night, but it's, it can be a lot. So, how do you keep them on with that? Presenting at all kinds of events, the sporting events, PTA, concerts. I think that's a really good idea. There's always, an opportunity when you have people coming into your building. All those school plays, you tend to get community members coming in to see, your middle school or high school plays, or even, your elementary band concerts. So those are great. Thank you for that. Decision making. So how do we help with that? I see on here a few, like surveys. Do people find that families get tired of surveys? I see somebody did mention they're doing phone calls. So
Yeah.
that is
Scotts
one
Grove
way.
says they just don't do them.
Okay.
They just, might choose not to do them.
Right. Yeah. And it's just throwing it out there, partly as, the facilitator today, just getting ideas from folks, but also, the dual role of also being the parent of kids who are still in, public school is, like it sometimes feels like death by survey. Those of you who are in PBIS, Carol and I can attest to the surveys that we asked to be, we asked them to be completed as part of the process. That can be hard to get everybody to complete them. We used to have to do several surveys, and they've cut that down, so that was really helpful this year. I saw better returns, not needing to remind people so many times. But surveys are certainly a really great way to go. You know, and the phone calls, if there are resources available to do that. I think, you know, grabbing people at some of those events you talked about on that first page, like what if people could access and give information when they're actually in your building, a paper survey, computers set up. Can you take this quick survey, you know, and easy to get input? And maybe you're not going to capture everybody that comes in, but you're going to get more data than you might have had, right? And certainly, you know, sending the surveys home. But you've been in places where they're like, oh, we only have 25% on the survey. If you didn't do it, can you do it yet? Right. So we get it. We're all trying. How about learning at home? Family math and reading nights. That's a really nice idea. Yeah, the Khan Academy, Speechify, you know, all of those kind of resources are great. We figured out we could link my son's SAT scores to Khan Academy, and it generated a 15-minute practice session every day for him. Like, wow, right? And I'm doing that in lieu of paying a tutor. Just, you know, what's going to work for our family. But there's all kinds of things like that. Again, reading workshops, just parent workshops on, you know, helping them access the things their kids would. I see maybe there's a couple districts on here, or a district that might have parent engagement specialists. Do people have social workers? Could your parent engagement specialist maybe be the social worker? Would they liaison with families at all? You can just comment in the chat about that. And here, our PBIS team created a rubric for homework and other expectations, you know, to help, you know, parents understand. So this is really great. You know, we hold these things, maybe they're well attended, maybe they're not, but it's all ways to build that community, to help people with decision making, to understand more of the identity of the people in your spaces, right? Your kids and your families. So it all goes a long way. And then finally, that idea of collaborating with the community. Yes, school board is the time. I don't know about you guys, but in some of the places around our county, those school board sessions have been something else, right? So that can be a plus and a minus at times. Field trip connections. Yeah, I remember once we took our kids on the train, and like that example earlier, you know, about the zoo. I had a kid who had never been on a train, was in like 3rd or 4th grade, and I had the best time of my life that day. So did all the staff, because we rode the train for the first time again, because just listening to him and reliving it was just, it was so amazing. And there was a part like, gosh, you've never been on a train. But then I was like, well, you don't live near where a train is, so I guess you haven't, right? Sometimes you have to think it through. More surveys, focus groups, connections. Oh, I love that with first responders. I think that's really great idea as well. And we gather data at the state. There's one here statewide, virtual school, but you know, you do your PBIS norms, and certainly PDE and the patent system have a lot of connections that we can utilize as well. So
Kari Pottsgrove said
Yeah.
they get sometimes surveys completed during parent teacher conferences with QR codes, and while the parents are waiting, they just click the QR code, do the survey. Because we always see parents in our hallway sitting, waiting to be the next one called. That's a great idea. That's a great, you know, a little couple minutes that they have available that they might, you know, get something done. And then Kari says that they have a separate role for a social worker and parent engagement coordinators to get that piece involvement.
Perfect. Thank you for all those shares. And that QR code, yeah, that's a really neat idea. And I find too, when we try to do some surveys in our role, Carol and I, short and sweet, right, guys? Nothing that's like a litany of questions. Can you get the information you need? it, kind of quickly. I think people are more apt to do them because they know it's fast. So just something to think about. Okay. So thanks for that. So, we want to think about, that community engagement, the family engagement, but overarching all of this is what is meaningful also to the students, and how do we get students, to be super involved. So if you look at this, ladder, where do you see your students? Anything in the chat there, Carol?
Nope, not yet.
No. Okay. Anybody want to talk about where do you see your kids here? At the bottom, it's we're trying stuff, we're using maybe we have some expectations, some consequences and rewards associated with them. But it's pretty like surface level stuff. At the next level, we're a little bit student centered, like we're starting to get some voice in there, right? About what the students like, don't like, what they think works, what could be done different, how, putting that in. They're consulted. That doesn't mean that it's like, kind of actually gets put in place. And then at the top, you see that more level playing field of your students, right? Like, they're giving opinions, they're being asked and given, and they have a voice at the table, and those conversations are happening. And so you start to see, some of that equality. You see sometimes where it's just all like, you're going middle school, high school, and thinking the kids are kind of driving the train here, driving the bus, to then at the top where you just get that equity between the students and the staff. So where do you think you are?
Emma replied student-centered.
Okay. Anybody else? Anybody feel like they're at the top or the bottom or the middle? Like you don't even have to pick a specific.
Yeah. Another student-centered, another student-centered, or student-informed. A lot of people in the middle.
Okay.
Looks like.
And that's okay.
Yep.
Yeah. This is just, an idea of, kind of just starting to see, like, we talk about this again when we start talking about student voice at times, whether we're working with systems in PBIS or not, but, like, then how do you start to have those conversations? Where do they lead? And so you kind of can go through, some of these stages, or maybe you're past some of those stages. How do you keep kind of, moving through the process?
Okay. One said it varies depending on families, but I would say student adult equality. Okay. So they're up on the third level. Perfect.
Very nice. So, we talked a little bit when you guys did the Jamboard, people mentioned the use of surveys and whatnot. But, one thing we find to be helpful is, how do you know what your climate is? We sometimes have a preconceived notion of how we think our building is, like, Sammy's elementary school or Brooks, high school or whatever, like, oh, everybody just loves it here, right? But these surveys that are often developed, by, organizations or whatever that have, vetted these out and, done the research, they have all this, good practice behind them. They help you really get to the nitty-gritty to really see how a staff or, community views that system. So it could be the whole district. Somebody mentioned they're like a cyber program, your whole system, or at the individual school level, right? And so these help you to think about the quality and character of school life. The school climate is based on patterns of student, parent, and school personnel's experience of that school life, and it reflects those norms, goals, values, interpersonal relationships, teaching and learning practices, and organizational structures. So when we think about, Pennsylvania and our MTSS framework, this is all built into what we want to see on, in that MTS framework, whether it's academics or behavior. The positive and equitable school climate supports the development and learning for all students. And I would say this could be true too of your staff. If you don't have a positive culture, your cultural climate for your staff could also be problematic, and not just for the students. The next thing we want to talk about, because we're coming quickly to the close here, I believe, is the supportive environment. What was the last thing you were acknowledged for? I'll tell you, I was acknowledged this morning for my pen OCD problem by Carol. It's probably not the right acknowledgement, but she knows I get giddy about it. So, but in all seriousness, what was the last thing you were acknowledged for? Just, you don't have to share, but just think in your mind. How about this question? When's the last time you acknowledged somebody else? Right? It goes both ways. So when you have a condition for a supportive school environment, people hold themselves accountable for implementing those school-wide systematic approaches. PBIS or not, whatever your school system determines are the practices that you hold dear that support the culture, identity, voice of your, all the groups, the stakeholders, the kids, the staff, to develop that. You hold yourself accountable to doing that. Staff understand and view the building quality of student-teacher relationships and providing behavioral instruction as integral to their role as instructors and as teachers. So think about that. Behavior instruction. That's not making the assumption that kids enter your class knowing what the expectations are. Right? One of the things I think you noticed that Carol and I have noticed through feedback and just being in buildings is, post-COVID, our young kids coming in out of preschool, these kids who are, babies, and they're coming into kindergarten, and they're still a little behind with the sitting in a chair, raising hand, like whatever the expectations are for those environments. So we hear a lot from districts whose kindergarten programs are just, they're in a state of transition because the kids are coming in needing that behavioral instruction. Kids who had been home for 18 months, thinking that they had just figured out what college looks like, and then had to come back into your building and not cut a class and not, have cheese doodle down their face while they're listening to you, but playing video games, right? There was a lot of behavioral instruction that went into those things. But how are we thinking about, we're going to talk, we're past COVID, we are back. How are we rebuilding and keeping building those, cultural expectations in our buildings? You have to teach the behavior. It is not somebody else's job, right? It is the community of the school's job to think about that behavior. And then we as educators build systems and practices to reach the goal of all students in the building feeling cared for and valued. We've been talking about this for years with inclusion, right? we decided as, rules, laws, whatever get passed, and, we want to see, better access for all individuals to the educational experience, those with disabilities. Well, belonging is not putting somebody in a classroom where they're not accessing anything, the education or the social environment. And that's true when you think about kids in any of these groups where we might see disproportionality, and our kids who are trying to figure out gender issues, to kids with certain medical conditions, disabilities, and again, other disproportionate groups, feeling cared for and valued. Right. And so that's what we're talking about here, that idea of supportive environment. When we know their voice, when we know their identity, we're a long way down the road of hitting that third bullet point. Nope. So let's just watch a little bit of this TED Talk because we're not going to have too much more time. But Christopher is going to talk to us about a space where each student is a full citizen, responsible for how well the class meets the collective academic, social, and emotional goals. Okay, there's not that much left, but we're running out of time. I like some of the things that he says, of course, why else would I show it? But the idea that, if we can engage in our students, if we're, as he just put it, watching rap concerts, going to the barbershop, basically going into the community and knowing the kids, the families in there, we're on our way to engagement, right? And think back on, some of the teachers you have who were, like he said, just dull, they just regurgitate information. They figured out how to do PowerPoint, and every day that's what you got, right? Things like that. We want to be more engaging because, the idea of what he's saying in my mind is that we start to understand who we are, but who's in front of us, by being able to tell those stories and, understand how people learn based on just who they are, their identity, their culture, a variety of reasons. So, sorry. So one of the things if we had time to think, about, he's talking about urban education. If we thought a little bit more about, we have some urban areas for sure here in Montgomery County, but just, in general, one thing we could look at is the idea of how do we do some of these things? How do we use our students' language? How do we showcase their culture? What does everybody have a purpose in the classroom? And you could call it a job, but sort of that purpose. But we're gonna come to a close very soon. So let's just move on to the idea, one of the last ideas, I believe, is situational appropriateness. And I always thought of this as an autistic support teacher all the time, right? Were my students prepared for an assembly and, those expected behaviors there. You're always quiet in the library. And that's why I didn't ever like a library, because as you can tell, I talk a lot. So, but what is that situational appropriateness, right? And how do we alter our behavior in settings, context, or when companions change, right? Kids are cursing. Whether we agree with it or not, I just don't want to hear it, right? So what's the hidden curriculum around some of this? All right, well, if you curse, you better make sure there's not an adult around. And I really don't want you to say those big curse words, but if you say darn it, whatever, but you know what I'm trying to say, that's the stuff, we have to think about. And some of families, that cursing isn't what it was, what it would have been in my family growing up, right? We didn't curse, and we certainly didn't curse in front of our parents, right? And some of us still feel that way, and some of us might feel like, well, I said the S word, I said the D word, like whatever, right? Like, so kind of understanding that. That's again understanding culture in just different families, not just culture because I come from this part of America or this part of the world. Some behaviors are appropriate in a student's home or their community. And so we have to, we have to think about that, and we have to talk with the community if those behaviors are not what's considered the norm. And how do we come to some consensus between what is our norm and what is their norm? That's, being culturally responsive. How do we, work through some of those conversations? And behavior instruction in schools should be tailored to the context and taught in the context in which the behavior occurs. Context matters. And it's going to matter, for some of our students who maybe sometimes have to learn two different sets of rules. No matter how much you might be okay with cursing, you're just not, at least not right now, going to see it okay to drop the F-bomb places, even if that's okay in somebody's home, right? So we got to teach context, like, dude, home is home, but here it's just a no, right? Like certain things, and being able to explain some of that context and set that as your culture as an entire school or school community. So I think this is an interesting example, so we have safe to say and no place to hate and all kinds of really great programs. And I know my kids are encouraged to report bullying, to the proper, grown-ups. And, so at school, we say to tell an adult. Well, at home, there might be like a different thing. Like if that kid is bullying your sister, like, hello, and this happened to my siblings, and this was back in the late 70s, early 80s. A boy touched my sister on the behind, and my brother had no parts of that. And my brother was going to get suspended, and the kid who touched my sister was not. Right. And that was the one time they called my dad before my mother. And my dad said exactly what the home said. That is his sister. And he did what he was told to do. And right or wrong, I get like kind of both sides. So, those are the things that we, sometimes have to, kind of come to grips with, right? So how do your actions change in different environments? That's all that situational sort of awareness and appropriateness. So in terms of the home, we think about, our family's collective experiences, those histories, and what's necessary for survival within the home and community. I think my dad was so adamant about, there are 5 of us, 3 boys and 2 girls in that order. He was raised by his grandparents. Not only did his parents divorce, which wasn't very common, he didn't even live with them, right? And so we were a very close family, and it was expected that we cared for each other and always had each other's backs, right? And so that's part of our cultural history, our cultural experience, and why he would have been so adamant about how my brother handled that situation. So we want to honor and respect things that are taught at home, but also think about what are those universal school expectations and what we need to be able to change to help, keep those dynamics between home and school alive. And part of that is, some of the stuff you put on the Jamboard, some of the stuff we talked about earlier. We have to have communication. We have to have our families and community members in our spaces to start to understand better where they come from. And again, I'm not talking about where in the US or where in the world, it's where they come from, you know, that house that they live in and the house they lived in growing up. Those are all the things that help come together. So if we can kind of get here, right, this would be, you know, maybe one of our goals is that this understanding is what will move the school climate from simply tolerating differences to embracing and honoring students and their experiences. So this is the last piece. This is what Carol talked about this morning. Again, there's a couple of you who were there. So, you know, understanding sort of these 5 areas, the situational appropriateness, you know, identity, voice, and whatnot, can help then lead you into thinking about all those data decisions and looking at data and disaggregating it and checking for disproportionality and helping you find solutions. So for more information for the rest of you guys, Carol's session was C2. It was from today, which is June 22nd, and it's called Using Behavioral Data to Improve Equitable Outcomes. So if you're putting some of this stuff in place today, if you learned a couple other things that you would like to try to do under some of those 5 tenets we talked about, as you're looking at that, then what does your data show? Carol's presentation would help you then tease out some of that information. Or if you want to say, after listening to me this afternoon, you know what, I'd like to know though, really, like, what is our data? They talked about climate surveys. Have we done that? Okay, so now we have all this data in our system. You may have Swiss, or you may have PowerSchool, or all kinds of other ways that you could pull data and look at that. But Carol's session would really help you pinpoint what to look at and what the data actually is showing you. So with that in mind, I thank you. Thank you again for participating in the MTSS conference. I hope you guys have a great summer and be in touch if you need anything.